one out.
Yeah, Russia, first vaccine. Putin doesn't listen to people that disagree with him. I'm like,
Nah, I'm
no.
good. I'm good. Oh,
Yeah.
so did you code? God, fucking damn, man. Okay, hold on. Give me 1 sec.
Oh, you're fine. Ukraine might get invaded. I like it. I was looking into that tsunami, like radioactive tsunami rocket shit they have. It's pretty interesting. I'll be right back. I'm gonna go turn something off real quick.
Sure. Okay, cool. Okay, cool. All right, that's that. We are live.
Okay.
All right.
Managed to hit my head, bump my knee, and knock over my mic in the last minute.
Nice.
Yes, success.
I think I'm all good to go. How about we do a little audio test just in case?
Absolutely, I agree.
All right, audio testing, normal speaking volume, and your turn.
Hello, everybody. I just bought some Lil Nas X Satan shoes. Yeah.
Sweet. Let me test that out.
And I double checked that I'm not using my
audio testing,
webcam.
normal
Mic.
speaking volume, and your turn.
Hello, everybody. I just bought.
Okay. Turn you down a little bit more on my end.
Yeah, I've come out much louder ever since I got this new mic. It's quite loud. I've noticed.
Okay, I think I turned you a little bit down, so you should be better now.
Awesome. Sounds good. Yeah, it's very glaring, I guess.
Okay. Cool.
Okay.
All right. Then we're good to go. So, do you want to intro the Chauvin trial one? What's the
Yeah, I could do that since I kind of put together just a little intro for that one. So I'd preferably yes, but I'm whatever works.
Sure, yeah, let's do it.
Cool.
All right. Then you're ready then, right? Sorry.
Yeah, I'm good to go. No, you're fine. Yeah.
Okay, recording in 3, 2, 1. I thought you were doing it or intro?
Oh shit! I'm sorry. Sorry, my bad. I had my notes up for Ukraine, and so I just for some reason. No. Yeah, hold on. Sorry. I don't know what happened there. I just completely mentally checked out for a second.
No, okay. That's all good.
Okay.
I figured. Okay. Take two.
Okay.
Take two.
All right. Let me know when we're good.
Okay. Recording in 3, 2, 1.
Hey, what up? Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Tonic Accord podcast. The first topic we're going to be talking about today is something that is pretty relevant. It is the trial of Derek Chauvin. He was the police officer that put his knee on George Floyd for about 9 minutes back in May. And currently the trial has started in Minneapolis, and it includes 3 counts of intentional homicide in attempting to accomplish an arrest. And if convicted, Chauvin could face up to 40 years in prison. So today we're just going to dive into what these counts are and our reactions so far as this trial is ongoing. So, Drew, how are you? This is a pretty heated topic, but other than that, how's life going?
Things are good here. People are getting vaccinated pretty rapidly where I live, which is exciting to hear. I'm hoping that within the next few weeks I can get on that list as well. Um, so yeah, I do. Yeah, I'm okay. Let's get into this trial because obviously this the incident in question, right? The incident that led to the death of George Floyd. A lot of people are describing that as a murder, and that is what we're on trial for here. The murder of George Floyd happened almost a year ago now. Led to the largest civil rights movement in history, I think you could say. I mean, the gatherings we saw were not just on a massive scale in the United States, but across the world even. Tons of publicity and news around this trial. So it's one of the larger and bigger trials that I think is going on today and will be going on in around a few years. Every few years you have trials like this that get so much attention, and this is one of them that's really, really politically and culturally charged. So it is important to, especially when we're talking about the logistics of the courtroom and the intricacies of the law. It's very difficult to do this, but at some points you have to kind of put these emotions aside and look at the realities of the specifics of the laws we're looking at and what laws were broken. And so I hope that while I do want to discuss the cultural implications of this trial, we can at least try and dive into the nitty-gritty of some of these details without getting too wrapped up in the emotional aspect, at least for a moment.
Absolutely. And I totally agree with you. I think there's just so many facets to this trial, which is going to make it not only historic, but potentially quite implicating, I think, on how civil society in the U.S. potentially is going to be for the next couple of months. I'd like to get into that maybe towards the end. But before we start, I just wanted to maybe discuss the three charges, just so everyone's kind of aware of what's actually being put forth here. And so Chauvin is facing three charges, which is second-degree unintentional felony murder. He's also facing third-degree depraved mind murder and second-degree manslaughter. And I just wanted to really fast, just explain these three. Is that second-degree unintentional murder is basically that the state's prosecutors would have to show beyond reasonable doubt that Chauvin caused Floyd's death while assaulting him. This is actually the most serious charge, and it carries a sentence of about 10 to 15 years. And I want to make it clear off the beginning, we are not lawyers, but this information's out there, and it's fascinating. So the second charge is third-degree murder, and basically third-degree murder requires prosecutors to prove that someone caused the death of another by perpetuating an act eminently dangerous to others. And usually this is actually used for drug dealers. Say like Bob sells Joe some heroin, and the heroin ends up killing Joe. This would be the charge that a prosecutor would bring forth typically to get the drug dealer, right? It's like not directly murdering somebody, but the outcome was murder. But there was a precedent in Minneapolis actually where there was a police officer who was convicted of third-degree murder in the death of someone named Damon after she was unintentionally shot during a police investigation. So there is a precedent for this. And the third one is second-degree manslaughter. And in order to convict Chauvin of second-degree manslaughter, prosecutors would need to show beyond reasonable doubt that he was culpably negligent and took an unreasonable risk while detaining Floyd. And so I guess my initial take on this is that these are three very interesting charges because we keep seeing the term beyond reasonable doubt coming up, and I think that's where the defense is going to try to go, is they're going to try to muddle the waters on beyond reasonable doubt in these, because these are very specific charges, and it's going to be interesting to see if they can prove beyond reasonable doubt some of these charges.
Yes, right, and so that's that's important thing to remember. That is, each charge comes with its own burden of proof, and so not every charge requires the same amount of meeting that burden of proof to be convicted of amongst the jury. Off the bat though, I mean, the second degree murder could go as high as 40 years. And then the third degree murder, the lesser charge of third degree murder, could go up to 25 years. And then the final one carries a maximum penalty, the second-degree manslaughter, of 10 years. Now, those don't always mean they're stacked on top of each other. A lot of times in cases where you do have multiple charges like this, depending on the defendant and how the trial goes, but you do see commonly a thing where someone will serve a term consecutively. So if he has 10 years for the second-degree manslaughter and then whatever, 25 for everything else, that 10 years is served consecutively within that 25. Well, basically serving it at the same time, to put it simply. But we don't know. We're not there yet. But just keep in mind that even if he gets convicted of all three, it doesn't necessarily mean they add on top of each other to 80-something years. It still could be 35, 40 served consecutively. So there's a lot of these intricacies in our justice system that it's important to remember. And you mentioned that lesser charge of third-degree murder. I guess in the writing in Minnesota, it says that it has to be committed an act eminently dangerous to others. And this was a point where the defense appealed to have this charge removed, and it was removed for a time, but then the prosecution appealed back, and it was put back in the trial. So that charge was dropped, then the charge was put back on, and now so he's got all these three charges facing him right now in this trial, and they, like we've said, come with some hefty time if convicted.
Yes, and so I'm just curious, of these three charges, which one do you think, and I'm just asking, there's
Sure.
no obvious answer to this, but which one do you think would be the most possible, I guess?
Well, and I'm no legal expert, but I did watch some videos from a pretty funny YouTuber. Well, not YouTuber. He's a lawyer first. He's a criminal defense lawyer named Bruce Rivers, but he has a YouTube channel where he gives some insight into big cases. Particularly, he does a lot with entertainment and rap. But he also talks about this trial because it's so big. And he talked about how, he's also a lawyer in Minnesota. He vlogs from across the street where the trial's going on. This criminal defense lawyer, and he talks about how he thinks it's pretty open and shut for the second-degree manslaughter. At least for that charge, which is the one that carries the lowest burden of proof. And that's the one with the maximum penalty of 10 years, as you can see on my screen here if you're reading on the video. And that would be, prosecutors would have to prove that George Floyd's death was caused by Chauvin's negligence in creating an unreasonable risk and consciously taking chances of causing death or great bodily harm. Now, what we've seen so far is, and just a lot more today, is that, one of the defense's angles is that, this was in line with training, or perhaps even that he was trained incorrectly. We're now seeing that a lot of not only his own coworkers in the police department in Minneapolis, but other trainers of use of force for the police department have said this is not something that they train. This is not something that was not accepted previously by the police department, and so Chauvin was acting outside of police protocol, which I think then makes the second-degree manslaughter pretty damn plausible that he's going to get convicted of that. I think the tough one is the one where you have the murder with the what was it, mannequin 10, or what did you say it was?
Well, there's second-degrry unintentional murder, which could be difficult because it's basically you have to show beyond any doubt that Chauvin caused the death while assaulting him. The third-degree one is basically the one that says you created a dangerous situation for someone and harmed others around you, which to me seems kind of vague and pretty hard to actually consolidate, if you know what I mean.
So let's get into this. So let's start with the lesser charge, the third-degree murder of act eminently dangerous to others, and that the reason that it was appealed successfully is that others part. The defense then said, look, he acted against, the act was involving him and George Floyd and all the other witnesses around, as emotionally distressed as they were. No one else was in any danger. And so that's why at one point that the appeal worked. However, then when the prosecution came back and appealed that decision, they successfully argued that no, that law means accidentally to others, and the others include George Floyd. George Floyd considered an other in this case because he, and so they argued that. So that one is a little vague as well. So that might be a little tougher. But I think that if the precedent stands that George Floyd counts as an other in this legal writing, then that he might get hit with that one as well. And then the toughest one is that second degree murder, even unintentional. I think it also comes with in Minnesota is that it has to happen while committing or attempting to commit another felony offense. And it can't be in a vacuum on its own. And so in this case, they're saying that the felony offense was assault, and then that unintentionally led to a murder, which is it's going to be tough to prove. And then, like you said, there's this angle of the drug usage and the fact that Chauvin was not the cause of death. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that and what's been said about that angle on the prescription drug usage.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, and I'll be honest up front that I haven't actually looked too much into the drug usage charges. I know.
Well, there's not the charges, but like the aspect of that.
Yeah. Excuse me. Yeah, bad way to put it, but yeah, like I know that he was a drug user. There was definitely a record of him being a drug user, but it's interesting because the defense's argument is kind of centered around the cause of death, right? Like they are trying to muddle the waters, and I mean I think muddle the waters sounds a bit biased. They're trying to provide an alternative reason, and so Floyd suffered from a heart severely compromised by hypertension and cardiac issues, and his medical condition was further compromised by the use of drugs and alcohol. That was what the autopsy revealed. It revealed none of the telltale signs of asphyxiation, no hemorrhaging, no injuries to the structures of the neck. And moreover, I guess the autopsy report argued that usually someone would lose conscious in 10 seconds and would die in 3 to 5 minutes with that pressure applied where people are arguing it did. But then the medical examiner found that Floyd's death was attributable to the pressure applied to his neck and torso. And so I think you have the prosecution looking at the medical examiner's side of it, but you have the defense more looking at the initial autopsy, which showed that it was actually not asphyxiation. Sorry, I have trouble with that word. And so that's, I think, where it's going to get complicated is because there's enough information on both sides that are trying to kind of overlie the other one in this. And so I think it gets really hard to say, was Floyd actually killed just by the force on his neck? Or was he already potentially having issues that could have been induced by being on fentanyl, and maybe the strangulation and the pressure on his neck added to that? And I truly think it's a complicated issue because yes. I am no. Yeah, sorry, go.
No, I'm agreeing. It is a complicated issue, but there are avenues to look at it because I agree with the idea that if you have fentanyl in your system, that it probably. It makes it more difficult to breathe, right? That's something that we know is a side effect of that drug. But there's a lot of steps that happens in the context of George Floyd being on these symptoms. So one was before George Floyd was on the ground, he informed the officers that he had ingested drugs, right? So he had informed them that, hey, I'm on a lot of stuff right now. And during the 9 minutes and 26 seconds when his neck, which the officer's leg was on George Floyd's neck, 4 minutes of that time, George Floyd had no pulse, right? Half of that time that leg was down, he had no pulse. And it is part of police training to check for a pulse, especially if you have someone under the influence of drugs.
Absolutely.
And then on top of that, you have when the EMTs got there and asked the officer to check vitals. The officer denied them the ability to do that, which is, again, outside of protocol. So I think so yes, you're absolutely right that the defense is going to try and say, hey, it was not Chauvin that killed him. It was the drugs and the stress. It happened internally. But I think that even if you buy that argument that, yeah, maybe it was more the drugs than but it was still the overall situation around it in which Derek Chauvin completely had so much negligence as to George Floyd's state of being, went against so much protocol that he has to get charged with at least that manslaughter charge. Go ahead.
No, I mean, absolutely. I think you're spot on right there. And that's the thing is why I think that second-degree manslaughter charge, again, would be pretty applicable to this, mainly because to me this sounded like bad policing and someone who did not know how to actually handle this correctly in the situation. To me, it's a moot point if he was on fentanyl or not. Like, I get that if he was on a drug that, could link to heart issues, breathing problems, obviously it's going to expedite the issue. But Chauvin at the beginning did not handle this situation correctly.
Right.
And that to me is what put Floyd at an unreasonable risk, which is used in the language for second degree manslaughter. And it talks about culpability negligent, right? And both of those things I think really shine on that charge, is because I know, like, a lot of conservatives now, which it's interesting how they've really flipped on this, but they want to, blame Minneapolis and the Minneapolis Police Department. But to me, it sounds like Chauvin individually made decisions that were not actually taught, and it was bad policing. And that's why, if Floyd was on drugs and that led to his death or not, the way that Chauvin handled the situation probably didn't help it. And I think that's why that second degree manslaughter would be applicable.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I think that one with the 40 years charge might be a little bit tougher. And again,
Yeah.
the nature of our justice system is that the prosecution has to convince the entire jury, whereas the defense only has to convince one, right? Because if you don't have a consensus, then you have a hung jury. So the defense has to do like a lot less than the prosecution in terms of like convincing and burning of proof, and that's a good thing. That's that's the idea we live in this country of innocent until proven guilty, and like in other countries it's the other way around, where you're guilty until proven innocent. So it should be a good thing that the prosecution has to overwhelmingly prove something of the charge, but that can lead to instances where perhaps people feel that justice has shorted them, where, people feel that this was a full-blown murder. And personally, I kind of do as well. I think the 9 minutes is crazy, putting yourself on that neck and refusing aid. So I do want to kind of shift a little bit to like the cultural aspect, because there's one thing I want to mention first, is that very interestingly, both attorneys, the lead prosecuting attorney and the lead defense attorney, both had a moment in their opening statements where they mentioned how they wanted to leave politics out of the courtroom.
Right.
The prosecuting attorney said, right here, right now, there's nothing else, but it's just a trial on these facts against this defendant, right?
Right.
But and leave the media and the political hubbub around it aside. It's very admirable. Obviously, that's how a court should operate. We don't want to have political leanings in come into play. But the reality is, with a trial of this size, they do. So I wanted to tell you
really quickly. Sorry.
Sure.
Before we get into the culture, I just really quick think that we should touch on what's actually happened in the trial so far.
Sure. I mean, yeah, okay.
Because like I actually think over the last couple of days, the defense's argument has actually, like, because the defense wants to open up the door to how he died, they've brought in a lot of witnesses from the Minneapolis Police Department, and it's actually looking less good, because it's almost like the Defense Department, or sorry, not the Defense Department, but the defense side is opening up Pandora's box, because now we've had the police chief of the Minneapolis Police Department saying that this was murder. We had Lieutenant Zimmerman of the department who said that putting a knee on the neck was uncalled for, and he was never trained to do so. We had the girl who put the video out, who's underage, so her full name hasn't been given, who also talked about how this was just like, I almost feel like the longer this goes on, the worse it gets for the defense side. That's all I just wanted to touch on, is that I just think that the longer this goes, because now we're having training experts coming out and saying, yeah, this is not how the police department trains their people. This was Chauvin's decision. And that kind of flips the entire rights argument that it was the city's fault, not his.
That's a very good point. And yeah, maybe I perhaps jumped the gun. No, you make a good point, is that it is rare to see a trial like this where so many fellow officers testify against a police defendant. There is the notion of the blue line, right? And this is not, pulled out of nowhere. It's very studied of the protective culture within the police force, that it's a fraternal, it's like a fraternity, like you're part of a group and you protect each other within that group. So it is very rare to see not just one, but a plethora of police officers actively testify against Chauvin, being like, no, he does not represent anything we do, right? The police chief of the Minneapolis Police Department testifying against him. I mean, your own boss, it's his boss, being like, no, he effed up. He completely did not follow protocol in any way. You also have use of force trainers, right? Guys that are specifically, their profession is to train police in the correct use of force and to not exceed it, right? They have now said that this was an excessive use of force. It is not looking good for Chauvin. So that's a very good point. So I wanted to bring that back to the conversation about culture, because it is, like we said, there's this blue line culture that is now showing to have some cracks, right? That I saw another commentator mention that, like what I just said, that it's very rare to see police testify so willingly against other officers, and in such a quick succession. But then, civil rights activist Al Sharpton said recently that, Derek Chauvin is in that courtroom, but America is on trial. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that comment. Is America on trial?
Yes, I would think so, because I was talking with our buddy Grayson, and he's been on the show a few times. We were talking about this a few days ago, and I was like, there seems to be a disconnect between just the utilitarian, what is right for society in this case, and maybe what the legal system is going to carry out in this case. And to me, it does show that if, let's just say hypothetically, if Chauvin was to be acquitted, it would be completely detrimental, I think, to our country as a whole, because I think even if it would show how, if the American people even full-heartedly believe that this was murder, if somehow he was acquitted, I think it would show that it would actually back up the argument that there are systematic issues with our criminal justice system. And because I think this case is super specific and super special, just because there hasn't been a murder quite like this caught on tape. And so since May, I think a lot of people have already developed their opinion. There's not a lot of gray area with this case. Like, if you talk to anyone, probably center left or center right, I think they're going to say that this was murder. Now we've had Fox News and some of the more right-wing propaganda networks have started to kind of muddle the waters, just kind of with how the culture in our country is going on the right. But my big issue is that I read an article in the New York Law Journal today that talked about, the article's called "Can Derek Chauvin Possibly Be Acquitted?" And they bring up an interesting cultural argument for why he could be acquitted. It's that basically the jury knows that they're being held together by what the public thinks. Like it or not, the public has already made their minds up. But then again, the judge and the jury want to prove that they're isolated and separate from public opinion, that they're not being swayed by public opinion. And I worry that this could be one of those historical cases where the court wants to make a point about being separated from public opinion. And I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I worry that in an attempt to prove that they're so separated from the public that maybe they could acquit him. And I feel like I don't totally agree with that statement that America's on trial, because I think most Americans think it was abhorrent, but I think it's our system that's on trial. Because I think it's our system that, look at these charges, that are going forth. Like, there's no charge for just directly murdering someone on camera. Like, there's no charge that just says that, no charge that makes it black and white. Instead, we have these kind of convoluted charges that we're hoping will get him. And I just worry that he could be acquitted, but it's not because the American people want him to be acquitted. It's because our system is so vague and gray that he could. And maybe that's what's going to end up, and I don't want to see what happens next. But I don't know, man. It's really tough to me, because I think he's guilty and I think he killed him, but I don't know if the legal precedent is there to do it.
Yeah, that's an interesting take, because I do feel that I've heard the same sentiment, that a lot of people are in agreement that, left and right, whatever political stance, I do think a lot of people are in agreement that the cop went too far. The cop certainly did something that was not justified. His use of force was not in comparison to the crime that happened, which was a counterfeit $20 bill, a nothing crime. So at least at least in that sense, I think most people are in agreement. But I think when Reverend Al Sharpton says that, America is on trial, I do think that this trial is kind of becoming this culmination of this decades-long movement to bring a light to the police brutality that is going on against African Americans. In particular, and this is again backed up by the data that in Minneapolis, police are 7 times more likely to use violence against a black suspect than they are a white suspect for the same crime, right? For the same crime. So I see this as I understand the rhetoric Al Sharpton uses, even though in the reality of the courtroom, you can't have that sentiment, right? If the prosecution lawyer said that or the defense lawyer said something like that, the judge would get mad because the courtroom is a very different place. But I do understand why people feel like America's on trial, because this led to the largest publicity around it. It led to a growth in the Black Lives Matter movement. As much as polarized as we've gotten, the Black Lives Matter movement, got, I think, probably record public approval during the height of the George Floyd protests. So I think, and I think there's an interesting point that I've heard from a few other civil rights advocates. They want to keep reminding people that this is a larger issue. They don't want it to just all be pinned on Derek Chauvin being a lone asshole. They want it to remind her that, no, this isn't just about George Floyd. It's also about all the way from Tamir Rice, all about Breonna Taylor, as far back as Rodney King, right? As this goes. So, so I understand the rhetoric that America is on trial, but I also agree with you that I do think a majority of people think that something wrong here happened. We can at least agree that something very wrong here happened, and hopefully find some sort of justice. But what is justice when George Floyd can't be brought back to life, right?
Yes, and this is one of those things where it's almost like public opinion and public sentiment and probably what is right are moving ahead of the tangible justice system that we have. We see this time and time again where sometimes people are ahead of the law in terms of where the public opinion's at. I mean, it takes the courts a long time to catch up.
Yeah.
And I just am really concerned that the public thinks that this case has already been settled, but the jury hasn't, and the jury wants to prove that they're independent from public opinion. I mean, there was a guy who was kicked out of the jury. I think it was last week in the first couple days, probably day one, and he had just expressed his thoughts that the police do single out African Americans, and he was told to leave by that. There are certain people that are being like the people that are still there, they're being asked to do something that I would never want to do.
Yeah.
They're being asked to balance justice with what is right. And sometimes, usually those are supposed to go hand in hand. But as we've seen, and you mentioned these other cases, they don't. And I'm just really concerned is that this is a case, especially with COVID, everyone was at home. Everyone saw this case. We all got super heated about it back at the time it happened, that everyone already thinks that this is settled. And I think for the sake of this country, but again, this isn't legal, but for the sake of this country, he needs to face repercussions. He really does, because there's so much anger and sadness and fear in this country right now. And to let a guy off like this, who I just think it would be detrimental to any form of unity. I mean, I can just imagine what like Chicago or Minneapolis will look like if
True.
Chauvin's off.
People
I
will,
can't even.
people will protest pretty vehemently, and I imagine some of it will be violent because
protest. I don't know how much protest is going to be happening after that.
well, it'll be a combination of both, but it will certainly be both rioting and protesting. I think people would be incredibly upset if he gets off scot-free. I do think, though, again, we're no legal experts to wrap this up, but the legal experts I've looked at and like lawyers that I've watched and heard commentary from, they do believe he's going to get convicted of something. They don't think
Right.
I don't think anyone thinks he's going to get everything, but I do think that at least that manslaughter charge, I mean, it's just so much evidence against this guy for that manslaughter charge. Like the fact that you have his whole own police department basically throwing him under the bus. I don't see how you could have him not get something, convicted of something. But like we said, I mean, the jury is the jury, and your peers are your peers, and who knows what they'll do. You have to beyond a reasonable doubt, but certainly it's probably the biggest case in the last 10 years, or one of the for sure, and really will either be a catalyst for a lot of uncertainty and tough times, or hopefully maybe be the catalyst to turn the ship and begin reforming our justice system to be more equitable and actually have policing that doesn't lead to deaths like this. But who knows, man? I mean, is there anything else you want to say? I mean, obviously this trial is still ongoing for those out there, so we don't know the end of it.
Well, I would just say, for the defense of my ex political pundits that I used to follow on the right, they do bring up an interesting point. Is that I think you shared, what was it, 17 or 18 times Chauvin's done something that's been considered misconduct.
Yeah,
and he was still brought back. I do think there's a valid question about, okay, Minneapolis didn't train him specifically to do what he did to George Floyd, but they also allowed a guy with almost 24 issues to still come back.
Yeah.
And that, to me, like, as you know, I've been a bit critical of the term systematic racism because I think it's hard to actually explain what that can mean. But I think this is an example of systematic issues. I'm not going to say just directly racism, but there's systematic issues with this guy. He's a bad apple. And I would hope that at least maybe police departments realize that when the spotlight's on you, you can't just let these bad apples stay.
I mean, talk about a horseshoe conversation point, because yeah, man, I agree. If that's what the conservative pundits are saying, that, well, the Minneapolis Police Department shouldn't have let them be so corrupt for so long, then, like, yeah, damn right. Let's investigate the police departments more. How about that? Maybe let's put way more accountability on police departments and who they hire and how they have these internal. If someone's investigated 17 times, that's what it was in the. I think let's get the exact stat, but yeah, you mentioned it. It was Derek Chauvin. Had 19 infractions, 19 policy infractions over 18 years. Over 18 years of police force, he had 19 infractions. So averaging one a year, this guy does something wrong. This guy
sounds like a bad cop.
Yeah, exactly. It sounds like a bad apple. And it sounds like the Minneapolis Police Department did nothing to remove that bad apple. Now, that doesn't mean that the bad apple can get off scot-free for his actions, right? Mm-hmm. If the bad apple murdered somebody, then he should be charged with murder. But then also, yeah, let's take it a step further. Let's start investigating police departments that don't fire cops after multiple infractions. I mean, how many times do you have to mess up before you're fired from your job, right? Why do cops get so much protection? Well, because the blue line, they have strong police unions, and the criminal justice system rarely prosecutes officers, and DAs don't like to prosecute cops because it's bad for their look. All this and this and that, right? Things that have been discussed on this podcast and plenty times before are all the reasons why we don't investigate Minneapolis Police Department as thoroughly as we should have. So if that's what conservative pundits are saying, then I am all for it. Talk about a horseshoe of agreement, because yeah, man, let's have way more accountability in our police departments.
Absolutely. And we'll keep you guys in touch with this. I unfortunately don't think this is going to be the end.
No.
I think we're going to see some interesting times ahead in this case. Hopefully he gets convicted. But yeah, let us know what you think. As usual, we're on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, all that other jazz. The you know the drill. So take care. Have a great rest of your week, and let's just hope justice is served here.
Yeah, let's hope. Thank you all. Take care.
All
Cool.
right.
Whew. Yeah, heavy, man. Heavy.
Yeah, I know that was such a There's so much meat in that one. It's like fuck.
Yeah.
That's why I almost wanted Grayson to come on for this one. He ended up having to study for a midterm, but I was like, it would have been easier just because he could have maybe broke down the actual legalese of this shit.
Yeah. He's got that more legal aspect.
Exactly. I'm gonna run to the banyo real quick, and then
Do your thing.
let's
do
get
your
into
thing.
a very light topic of Ukraine. It's
Yeah.
not light, but it's a little bit easier to talk about, I guess.
At least we could crack some jokes about it.
Exactly. I'll be right back.
Stoic, I saw your comment. Yeah, we're getting into Ukraine now. I don't know if you're still there, bud, but yeah, I don't feel like Putin is stupid enough to invade Ukraine. Well, definitely, probably not a full-scale ground invasion. You're right. That would probably lead to a mass sanctioning, and we'll get into it more. Why he wouldn't do a full-on invasion, but he certainly has done before. Done little operations with paramilitaries and like halvesies soldiers to justify defending Russian interests and peoples in an area. He did this in Georgia. He did this in Crimea. So there are ways for him to seize power and influence in Ukraine without doing a full-scale invasion. So that's what we're looking at because they're building up. They're building up military forces on the border of Ukraine again. As well as bolstering their forces around Belarus and Poland and also the Antarctic. So, yeah, they're doing something. So we're going to look at kind of the comments of a bunch of different, foreign relations and international policy experts and kind of give our thoughts on this ongoing issue. So definitely stick around. This is more the international, more global side of the Tonic Accord. Wow, so true. Thanks. So true. Much politics. But yeah, we're just waiting for Alex to get back from a little break as we switch into the next episode. So yeah, if you're just tuning in now, we just covered kind of the updates with the Derek Chauvin trial, who is on trial for the murder of George Floyd. Heavy stuff, but definitely want to take a look at that because we do dive into the nitty gritty of some of the legalese involved. And now we're going to do more of the international stuff and regarding Russia and Ukraine. Ruska.
I don't feel like Putin is stupid enough to invade Ukraine.
Yeah. Maybe. Well, we'll see what. I was just replying to that. It's if he's talking about a full-on invasion, a full-on ground invasion, then I think I agree. But we're gonna get into the other ways he can do such a thing.
Right.
All right. Well, if you are good to go and I am good to go, then that sounds like we're both good to go.
That sounds like we're good. We good.
Then I will get us started. All right. Ready? Listo?
Let's do it. Vamos, amigo.
Vamos. Recording in 3, 2, 1. Welcome back to the Tonic Accord. Today we're going to be talking about Russia and its massive buildup of forces on the eastern Ukrainian border. And if this sounds like deja vu to you, you'd be right, because this is not the first time Russia has done such a thing. In fact, there has been an ongoing armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine on that border for the last 7 years. But we're starting to see a build-up, an increased presence in not only Ukraine, but Belarus and Poland. And we're going to be talking about what not only our thoughts on that development and Russia, as well as the United States' role in this in Russia's doings in Europe, but also be looking at some of the commentary from international policy experts and foreign relations experts and people familiar with Russian security and looking at what the hell are they doing over there. So let's get into it. Alex, hope you're doing well. We just finished our domestic episode about the Chauvin trials, but now let's shift gears more worldly. Yeah, man. What do you think when you see a buildup of Russia, and how do you think other countries should respond?
Okay, so I think that the Crimea situation is complicated because just for the historical context, because
Definitely.
because I don't think we've actually ever talked about the Crimea issue before, but just so people know, I mean, Crimea has historical ties to Russia, and it was kind of on and off with Russia for the last like 2 to 3 centuries. They were annexed by the Soviet Union. They were on and off as part of the Russian Empire until the 50s, and they also were kind of a political moving piece during the Soviet Union because they also have a pretty predominant Muslim population that was very anti-Soviet for obvious reasons. And so, it was interesting because in 2008, the Ukrainian government was kind of calling out Russia for giving Russian passports to the population in Crimea. And the Crimean population, by a general majority, supported being Russian. They were separatists to a certain extent. And so even when the ex-president of Ukraine, whose name I actually don't have here, but the ex-president of Ukraine, when he stepped down in 2009 for corruption charges, the people of Crimea still supported him. And so I think it's not stupid that Putin annexed Crimea in 2013, I think it was, because the people actually were very pro-Putin. There's a lot of pro-Putin politicians in Crimea.
Right.
And so it gets super complicated to me when there's historical ties, and it kind of sums up, I think, this whole region where it's super complicated to just say it's Ukraine or it's Russia. These are old territories with old ties. And so I think if you're Putin, it makes sense to you. So that's why I didn't like the comment that Putin is stupid enough to invade Crimea, or he's not stupid enough to invade Crimea because
not Crimea, Ukraine.
Right. Because I think in his eyes that it would be something that would be good for him. And so what I would just say off the bat is that Putin's not doing well at home. Domestically, his popularity is waning. And so I think, when you're having trouble at home, you go to war. And so I think to Putin, this would really help his standing as a nationalist and bring back that Russian Empire vibe.
Yeah, that's a great point. So let's get into the details. You mentioned he's not doing well at home. Coming up in September, it's parliamentary election. So not election for Putin himself. This guy's good, and in fact, he just started signing legislation that might ensure him to have power until 2036. But so Putin's in power. However, there is a parliamentary body underneath him that can have a limited but somewhat ability to curtail what Putin wants to do. So he definitely does not want the parliamentary body underneath him to go against him. And they are waning in support. And part of the reason they're waning in support is you have figures like Navalny, who led a very more Mulvaney, right? Wait, am I saying it right? What is it? No, Navalny.
I think it's Navalny.
Navalny. Well, I'm not good with these Eastern European names, but Navalny, right? Leading a pretty popular and prominent opposition group to Putin, vocally criticizing the Kremlin. Now he was jailed, and then he was poisoned, and then jailed, and then now he's suffering a ton of medical issues in jail that has sparked a lot of controversy. There's a lot of attention around opposition to Putin that is gaining traction. So that's one of the reasons why he is perhaps a little worried about these parliamentary elections in September. That might curtail his power. On top of that, like you said, is one of the things you do in that case is you go to war, and that has proven to work not only with the annexation of Crimea, but there's also been military operations in Georgia that have allowed Putin to kind of declare a small and decisive victory that boosts support back at home. So this is not something new either. We've seen this happen before, not only in Russia, but across all sorts of other nations, where if you can get a small strategic military victory quickly, it can boost support at home. This is so Alex, your theory is lining up with, this lines up with what some international experts are thinking as well, which is would Putin want to just go full-blown blitzkrieg invasion of Ukraine? Probably not, but doing some sort of operation using these paramilitaries and getting some sort of political victory might help his chances of retaining parliamentary power in September. Everything is connected in these instances, right? And history is not in a vacuum.
Right, and I totally agree with that. And I actually just wanted to touch on the Georgian thing for a minute, because Putin has a trend of basically creating a red line. And then once his definition of what that red line is crossed, then he justifies a response. And in Georgia, that happened. There was a region that was, I have it written down. It doesn't really matter, but it's the Ossetia region of Georgia, which was pro-Russian as well. And basically, there was a separatist movement to basically be. I don't know if it was meant to separate or join Russia, but it was meant to basically not be part of Georgia. Either way. And so basically Putin had a red line where it was like, we're not going to go in there. And then there was some Georgian opposition to Russians in this region. And then he basically went in and his troops, started attacking these separatist helping these separatist groups in this region. And then the Georgian government, rightfully so, responded. And then Putin's like, see, we had a red line here. You crossed it. So now you want war. So that started probably the first European war since World War II in terms of scope. And it's basically Putin just he creates his own red line, and when the government of the country that he's creating the red line for crosses it, then he justifies invasion.
Right.
And I don't think he wanted to invade Georgia. He just wanted to take that Ossetia region. And same here. I don't think he wants to invade Ukraine. He just wants to use it as a general way to justify taking a region. And that's kind of his thing. I don't think he's we need to just make all of Ukraine part of Russia. But it's this idea of Putin kind of creates the rules of the game, and then if you disobey them, it justifies a response.
Yeah, I mean, well, he certainly. Yeah, I agree that he probably doesn't, or at least not anytime soon, wants to do a full takeover of Ukraine. But he does, I think, currently hold 7% of sovereign Ukrainian territory is just occupied by Russian forces, which is crazy to say. Let's take a look at Codenser's comments here. How can other Balkan states engender a nationalistic cultural unity in their countries to avoid the Russian takeover that happened in Ukraine? That's a tough one, man, because nationalistic cultural unity in the Balkan states is not something that happens often. Well, nationalism certainly happens a lot in Balkan states, but a pan-Balkan cultural unity, I don't see that happening at all anytime soon. So I certainly can't say much to how that would happen, but I do think that the leaders involved in these countries are super important, whether or not they're willing to play ball with Putin or not. So we talk a little bit about Belarus. I'm so bad with these names, but the current leader of Belarus is blanking on it. However, he
starts with a V. That's all I know.
Yeah, but he is. But they're doing a lot of military drills and trainings together with Russia, to a point where basically Russia has a almost perennial military presence in Belarus. A really interesting way to, one, not only sword rattle, which is let everyone else in Europe know me and Belarus are buddies, and F you, we have a ton of sick jets and training and soldiers, but also to just basically use the idea of, we're just going to do practice exercises as a way to basically just have troops in Belarus all the time. So I don't know. I'm not exactly an expert on the Balkan states individually, but I imagine if they just try and prevent leaders from letting that happen. Is there a cultural fracturing in other Eastern Europe states which makes them vulnerable to pro-Russian, or is it just Ukraine?
Yes.
No, yeah, absolutely. I mean, even within Ukraine, there is the pro-Ukrainian government military that is fighting against Russia. There's also Ukrainian anarcho-separatists that hate Russia, as well as their own government, that are fighting in eastern Ukraine. So, I mean, absolutely. I mean, cultural fracturing in Eastern Europe go together like peanut butter and jelly.
Well, and also I don't even know if I'd use the word cultural fracturing in a lot of these Eastern European states. I think right offhand of the Czech Republic and Poland. It's not that there's a cultural fracture. It's more the fact that there's opportunist populists who would like to buddy with Putin. I actually see that as more of the bigger issue. Less so that you have a Polish minority that feels like they connect more with Russia. I think it's the fact that you have a growing kind of nationalist right-wing agenda that seems to be aligned with Putin, so they're more willing to maybe accept his influence in these elections. Poland right now is seeing a huge schism in terms of what does this country stand for? Is it European, or is it more Eastern and more linked with Russia and the Soviet past? And I almost feel like nationalism in general is somewhat dangerous in this part of the world right now, because they were all forced to be lumped together for so long with the Soviet Union, that there's still this opportunistic authoritarian fringe that will always remain. And so I don't know if it's as much like being pro-Russia or connecting with Russian culture, but it's opportunism. And that's what scares me more about Eastern Europe right now. And Putin is taking advantage of that. And he did so in Ukraine as well. I mean, the fact that Ukraine's ex-president in 2009 stepped down for corruption charges, and Putin and his propaganda networks inside of Russia fanned the flames in Crimea, and they still supported this guy, shows to me that there's almost like two worlds inside a lot of these old Soviet countries, where you have like kind of the more EU-leaning, progressive, democratic leaders, and then you have the Soviets, the ex-Soviets, that still want to go back to that. And Putin knows that, and he's taking advantage of it.
Dang, yeah, that's a good point. It's perhaps it's less about being more like Russia and more about being less like Western Europe. Like they want to be authoritarian. They don't want to be EU based. That's a good point. And certainly interesting questions, Code Dancer. Thanks, man. Yeah, so let's dive into some of the expert takes. And the responses from the world. Because all we're seeing right now is a buildup. From what I understand, that various intelligence have seen that there's a buildup of troops on the border of Ukraine, as well as that the military exercises in Belarus. Some buildup in Poland. And then we've also mentioned, outside of the context of just the Ukraine area, Russia has been building up forces in the Arctic, has been refurbishing bases near Yakutsk, which is near Alaska, right? So I see a trend, at least, of, Moscow and the Kremlin bolstering forces in general. But obviously targeting Ukraine, which is a NATO ally, has gotten the reaction of President Biden. And so President Biden, along with a multitude of his staff, have called Ukraine and its officials, and have reiterated the United States' want to respect Ukrainian sovereignty, to defend its ally in that region. And while that's always good, and a lot of these experts in this great AtlanticCouncil.org piece, they all pretty much wholeheartedly agree that that's at least a good response. Some of them think it's not enough, and it is worth pointing out a valid criticism is before the Crimean invasion, Barack Obama's administration also said the same thing, that they were like, we are 100% in behind supporting our Ukrainian allies, NATO ally, and there's a red line, and Russia annexed Crimea, right? And the world kind of moved on. So as good as it is that President Biden has reiterated our position in defending Ukraine and as it's an ally, words are just words, and I do think that we need to open up some serious, serious sanctions. I frankly agree. I forget which one, which expert it was here, but one of these guys kind of went off and basically said, why are we not treating Putin like the rogue dictator he is? We keep acting like he is like, oh, well, he's technically a president in Europe. Like, no, man, this guy is a rogue dictator and he's acting like it. We should have rigorous sanctions. We should have visa sanction on all of his top officials, right? And I think that, I hope that the Biden administration will look at options like that. But right now we know that they have just kind of called to Ukraine to reiterate our alliance with them. What do you think of that, Alex? Is that enough?
I think that it kind of highlights the big issue that we're having right now with Russia, is that I don't think the West, and I feel like I've said this before maybe on this podcast, but I feel like the West doesn't understand Putin. Like, and that's why they kind of keep brushing him off as just this kind of like neo-Soviet czar-esque type of figure, but no one actually does anything about it. Like, I agree with you that sanctions are probably the most straightforward option, but we've done them, and it just seems to almost like allow Putin to like consolidate a more nationalist approach at home. Like considering that Putin controls the media and controls almost all the apparatuses of government, I feel like sanctions are just what he can turn against us as a propaganda tool. And like, I almost feel like the U.S., I think we need stronger rhetoric, but at the same time, I don't think it's the U.S.'s job in this one. I think places like Germany and the EU are the ones who actually need to take a stronger stance. Foreign Policy had an amazing article talking about how this could be Germany's time to put their foot down, because they argue that, so there's this Nord Stream pipeline, that goes from Russia to Germany, and it's basically, in my opinion, horrible because Germany is accepting a bunch of gas from Russia, and this Nord Stream pipeline goes right through eastern Ukraine. And so let me read this part where it says U.S. officials pointed to Putin's desire to pressure Germany on multiple fronts, including the controversial construction of the undersea Nord Stream 2 natural gas pipeline that would bypass Ukraine and the Berlin-led trilateral contract group that is tasked with ongoing ceasefire negotiations in eastern Ukraine. So their point is that if, like, it almost seems like Putin is trying to take the limelight away from this pipeline, and he wants to like cause this invasion there so that like the focus is on this pipeline that bypasses the region. And like this is where I think like Germany as I don't want to say progressive, but as democratic as Angela Merkel is, she's quite pro this pipeline. And I think what would be the best step is that if Putin feared Germany, there could be a halt in this pipeline and maybe some form of retribution. And also, that same article argued that NATO needs to work with Ukraine. Why don't, instead of allowing Ukraine to slowly go towards Russia, how come NATO doesn't try to embrace Ukraine with something they called the Membership Action Plan, or MAP? And it would show them that they could become a member over time. And I think those are the things that need to happen here, is that we need to give Ukraine a reason why they should not allow any Russian interference. But instead, it's like, yeah, the U.S. says, yada, 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 this is bad, we'll sanction you. And Germany is accepting a pipeline, though they're also saying Russia's bad. It's like the mixed messaging over time has made it that no one knows what Putin wants. And I think that's Europe. I think Europe needs to take a more frontline seat in dealing with Putin and Russia.
I agree with that. I certainly agree with that. But I just fear that they can't do much without the heavy hand of the United States. Like the reality is,
Fair.
you know, I mean, this was, this was Trump's criticism of NATO in general, which is the reality is the United States foots most of the bill. And that is the reality. Now, I'm okay with that. I think it's in the global and United States interest to have that agreement. But that is the reality that, the United States is vastly, vastly stronger militarily and economically, and is the reason that we can even have something like NATO exist. So I'm not sure. I don't think I agree with your take that we need to let Germany and France have more of a position in this. I agree with you that they need to have more of a say, and I agree with you that it's hypocritical of Merkel to be so to say one thing and then go in the back door and want a pipeline. I also, side note, it is really, really funny when you see these like progressive or at least somewhat progressive politicians completely switch when they get a pipeline deal. Like Justin Trudeau. Trudeau really wanted that Keystone pipeline. Man, it really must be liquid gold in their pockets, man, because they love them pipelines. Anyway, no, but I think that in the long term, it's more beneficial for the United States to have a greater seat at the table. Though, while you're right, it's not our fight and stuff like that. I want to steer back into the United States being more active in Europe, being more active with our European allies, and beyond that, eventually not just Europe. I mean, I'm active with all of our allies and create more allies around the world. And I think that Biden is trying to do that as well. I think that Biden's idea is to go against Trump's America only and America first rhetoric and try and be way more active with our allies. And one of the theories from these experts is that maybe this is just that. Maybe this is just Russia testing Biden to see if he really is trying to get back in with his European buddies as much as he says he is. And it could just be maybe a test, but I don't know. It's tough to say.
No, I mean, I absolutely agree with you that the U.S. needs a stronger role. I just feel like due to the proximity of some of these countries to Russia, this mixed messaging that people like Merkel's government have been doing, it's just not beneficial because like the thing is, at the end of the day, like popular opinion in the U.S. is still, I mean, like Americans, I think, still want to have a role in the world, but that is waning. You have not just Trump's side, but you also have the Bernie Sanders type saying that we're And so, like, I just feel like over time we are going to see a waning of U.S. power. And the other thing is that under Trump, like I think we talked about this last week. Like, I think both of us somewhat assumed that after Trump was out of office, the EU was going to come running back to the U.S. And in some ways they have, but in some ways they haven't. And I think that the EU has realized that they can't count on us, which was a huge travesty of Trump's administration.
Sure.
But at the same time, like, I also understand it is that Germany's rhetoric can be fine and strong towards Russia, and they can condemn Putin, but when they're literally allowing a pipeline to go in, it just seems like maybe NATO and the EU do need to pick up some of these pieces, because at the end of the day, this is them who are going to have to pay for this Russian interference. I mean, Russia was interfering in the British elections. They were interfering in almost all these like French elections, German elections,
Ukrainian elections.
Ukraine. I mean, but it just kind of pisses me off, is because the U.S. can only do so much. Like, we can only do so much without actually going into a full-blown conflict there. And I don't want these quasi-satellite conflicts anymore. It's like, at the end of the day, the EU, I don't even know if it's military might, but they need to have more diplomatic might against Russia, and they somewhat seem hesitant to do so.
You certainly make a great point that it can't just be the United States up there alone calling the shots, or like, what's that, like all that, like those goofy like high school fights where you're like, you come up to the bully like, we're gonna take you on, like, yeah, you and what army, and all your friends behind you have already dipped and you're just there alone. That does feel like that with the United States sometimes, especially if you have Merkel with a pipeline on backdoor deals that prevent her from being stronger on the table. I hear that for sure. I just worry that the solution is to not go at the table. The solution is to put pressure on Russia, but then also give Merkel a call and be like, look, you got to decide: is a pipeline worth ruining your relationship with everyone else in Europe? Because that will, maybe we got to be a little bit tougher. I'm fine. Like, there's a way to be tougher. There's a way to give tough love to your friends. That's not just like leaving the basketball court and like, I'm not gonna participate anymore. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's going to be the big struggle now. And last week we talked about it, how it does seem like in some ways Trump really changed foreign policy for the United States. This kind of like transactional approach to not only allies but also dealing with enemies.
Yeah.
And I think that this is another issue that's going to put pressure on the future of the EU, because like you do have actors inside of the EU like Hungary that are kind of buddy with Putin.
Yeah.
And I think it's a more macro issue that we need to face, is that what is the point of a free trade agreement inside of Europe that supports capital markets, democracy, and open trade, but at the same time, there's countries in there that are buddy with Putin. Like, I don't see this issue going away. I see it maybe escalating, and the fact that what if some of these other countries that are in the EU and are NATO allies start saying, like Turkey, for example. Turkey's a Russian ally. They also have a major seat at the table in NATO. Like, what happens when this issue does come up to a grand discussion in NATO, and you have a split over what Russia should do? Like, I feel like the time to deal with this was about a decade ago.
Absolutely.
And now it seems like we're seeing schisms inside of these organizations that are supposed to be immune to that, I guess. So it's really tough to me to see what happens, especially with the Arctic now and just this massive mobilization there. And the worst part is China's just sitting back with their popcorn.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Hey, and any attention that Europe can then put on Russia takes away attention on China. I mean, yeah, well, I mean, maybe, perhaps. We're still seeing what happens, because now we're looking, there might be a full boycott movement of the 2022 Chinese Olympics because of the Uyghur situation. Right. But yes, I imagine if I'm China, if Russia is getting all the attention for a buildup in Ukraine, I imagine they'd be happy to not be in the spotlight of the EU and the US's crosshairs. Yeah, well, certainly it is. I agree with you that it should have been solved, maybe, I don't know, pulling a number out of my ass here, 7 years ago, before Crimea was invaded. Probably should have been a little bit tougher on Russia then. I think that's a fault of the Obama administration. I think they called a red line, and then when the red line was crossed, nothing really happened. So will Joe Biden be tougher? Will he be in step with his European partners? Certainly more so than Trump, but it's going to be tough with situations like Merkel, who has, she has in Germany has economic interests and ties to Russian pipelines that go through Ukraine. It's a very complex, and like you said, it's certainly not going anywhere. Russia's periphery movements in Europe are nothing new, and like we said, are happening in places like Belarus, Poland, Georgia, and obviously Ukraine. But yeah, fascinating stuff, dude. I hope I make it to the day where we can see a Russia without Putin. I think I will. I hope I will. Gosh, I'm not that old. But I think so much of Russia's destiny is in this one guy's hands that it's hard for me to picture a Russia without him. But I hope I do. I hope we see it. But I really feel like once Putin goes in one way or another, it will open up the possibility of a real reform to a more democratized and modern Russia. But as long as Putin is in power, man, this is the MO for that time. And it sucks because he just got power for another 15 years.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you're spot on there. And it seems like, in my opinion, I think the Russian people have a kind of traumatized cultural memory, in the fact that they didn't just lose the Cold War, they also kind of lost their
identity,
their pride. Yeah, their pride, their identity, and Putin's just been the only person who's kind of tried to help them get that back.
Yeah.
And that's why I think China is a bigger threat in the long-term scope of things.
Absolutely.
And they pose, they pose a more serious problem as of kind of the meta philosophy of international politics, democracy. But Russia may be more of a direct threat. I remember back in the Obama-Romney debates, Romney got kind of criticized for saying that Russia still is the biggest threat. And I think they're a more tangible threat because China would never do these type of things if it directly hurts their trading partners. Yes, the Uyghur situation, as we're seeing, might backfire, but China wouldn't just seize a territory in a neighboring country. And that's why I think Russia is just more desperate. And so that's something that really will need to happen. I think you're right. And I think as long as Putin's there, the stuff is going to continue, though it might get more erratic and bad, actually, the older and more crazy he gets. Yay.
Well, let's see if the main theory that the main theory that I'm seeing is that this is happening because of the risk of losing power due to the parliamentary elections in September. Mm-hmm. So for those out there that want a takeaway, keep an eye out. If stuff starts to get a little bit crazier in Ukraine right before September, I don't know, maybe some stars are aligning. So just keep that in mind, and keep in mind the context around Ukraine and Russia and why this would be happening. Because again, as I've said before today, none of this happens in a vacuum. It's all connected, and it all goes deeper than you think. And we've barely just scratched the surface. So obviously, look into it more if you're interested in this topic. Look into our own episodes about the Arctic, Russia's increase in military presence in the Arctic. We've talked about Russia in many different regards in the past on this podcast before. So I encourage you to check that out as well. But with that should wrap up this episode of the Tonic Accord. You will catch this VOD posted online on YouTube, or the audio on Spotify, Podbean, Apple Podcasts, and a host of other sites. Let us know your thoughts. We had a ton of great comments today on the Twitch live stream. So if you do want to see it live and engage with us live, we usually go live on 5 p.m. Pacific time on Tuesdays. So catch us there if you want to say hi and make fun of us a little bit or something like that. And with all that said, thank you again for watching the Tonic Accord, and we'll catch you next week.